We made our cushion. It's extremely boxy. It needs a little bit of life in it. It needs to look lived in, stuffed, and sat upon. Right now, it looks like a box. I could go ahead and start sculpting it at this point, but a better idea would be to sort out its UV layout. It's just going to be much more straightforward if you do the UV layout before you start sculpting, in this case at least, because it will be a very regular grid pattern in the UV texture editor and very easy for you to identify things and manipulate them. Okay, so let's unisolate it. It's currently isolated. I can turn that off and assign the material to it. Select it and right-click and assign existing material, sofa material. We can press the 6 key and see what kind of UVs there are on here. Basically, it has the UVs from the original cube. And they're actually better than you might expect. I mean, we're seeing some issues here on the bevel. But on the original cube, it's essentially the same as automatic mapping. We could try adding automatic mapping here, but it's really not going to do a good job. Let me just show you what happens. If I select it and choose Create UVs, Automatic Mapping. We can go into Edit UVs, UV Texture Editor and take a look. And what we see is that it's done a layout, but it's not one that's easy for us to manipulate. There's a lot of fragmented pieces here, and we can't really work with this. Let's think about what we need to do. If we want to be true to material here, then that means we want to think about how it would be sewn together. I think we would have one piece at the top, and one piece at the bottom, and then one piece wrapped around. So knowing that, we can produce seams in certain locations. So essentially, we want to create a seam between the UVs right around here. And that's going to hide it underneath this fold. Okay, so to make this happen, we need to select very precisely. And we're just going to forget about the automatic mapping for now. In fact, we can undo it if we want. Press the Z key. We want to select all the faces around here. Let's look at this just in shaded mode with the 5 key. To separate out the UVs, to make this side strip of fabric a different shell in the UV texture editor, we can select using face selections. Right-click and go into face component mode and use the select tool. Select a face and then shift double-click to select an entire face loop. Control-shift to add to the selection, and then shift double-click to add the entire face loop. And then extend the selection, shift period. Do that a couple of times. Get in close and check it. So now I've selected that entire side strip. So that I don't lose that selection, I want to save it. But first, let's double check. Go into Wireframe, 4 key. Make sure you've selected what you think you have, and nothing more. Back to shaded mode with 5. And save that selection. Create Sets. Quick Select Set. And call it Side Strip Set. Click OK. And then if I lose that selection, let's say I click off of it, I can always get it back. It's going to be found under Edit, Quick Select Sets, Side Strip Set. Very cool. And this is a selection that we can use for automatic mapping, and it will be more or less fine. Create UVs, Automatic Mapping. We can look at the texture with the 6 key. We can also visualize the UVs using the UV texture editor. Right-click and go back to object mode. And then back into Edit UVs, UV texture editor. And this is the layout currently. We've got our strips here. They've been sort of normalized into the 0 to 1 space. And these are the tops and bottoms, which are not terribly well organized. They're kind of fragmented and hard to work with. But these are pretty clean, so we can select those. Right-click and choose Shell Component Mode and select all of these. And move those out of the way. Just use the Move tool. The W key is the shortcut to move. So it looks like we want these to be rotated around. The Rotate hotkey is E. And if I want to snap rotate or discrete rotate, hold down J and turn. Now you'll see I've got the stripes running the opposite direction. I can additionally turn on this option here in the UV texture editor, display checkered tiles. And that replaces the current material. And we can check for seams and errors in the model here. And turn that back off if I want. I want to sew all these parts together. Let's look at this in shaded mode once again. Press the 5 key. And I want to just isolate this object. Once again, go into object mode. Select it. And then isolate it up here. That way it'll be easier for me to track what I'm doing in the UV texture editor. So I want to sew these parts together now. Just identify the edges. Right-click an edge and select one and see where its corresponding edge is, and then move and rotate the shells accordingly. So in this case, I'll right-click and choose shell, select that shell, and move it with the W key, and rotate it with the E key, holding down J to discrete rotate. Bring that around 180 degrees. And I can also move, I can use the W key. You can see my move manipulator's active here. And I can move here even if I don't have the move manipulator visible. If I middle mouse drag, I can move in both axes. And when those are next to each other, I can sew them. Right click and choose edge. And you'll see I've got two edges adjoining one another. Go back to the select tool with Q, and then CTRL SHIFT to select edges. One thing you can do is you can hold down CTRL SHIFT and drag, then you'll select extra edges, but you can go back, hold down Control only, and subtract. And once again, polygons move and sew UV edges. And do that throughout. We do want to identify where the seam is going to be. Let's go out of isolate mode for a minute and check this out with selection highlighting. I'll dolly back in the UV texture editor. Let's say I want the seam to be back here where no one will see it. I can hover my mouse and I'll get selection highlighting in the UV texture editor. And that's telling me this will be the border of that shell, and this will be the other border. So I know a lot just from doing that. I can go back into shell mode, select, and then rotate with E and hold down J. Turn that around because I kind of now know in advance. Back to the move tool. I kind of know that's going to be over here. This one we're not sure about. So once again, we can go into edge component mode, select, figure out where the corresponding edge is, so it's over there. Right click and go into shell and rotate. Cool, and once again, go into edge mode and select. Sew all the rest of the edges. Let's admire our work. Go back over to the viewport. Press the 6 key. Figure out the scaling of this shell relative to the rest of the model. Right-click and go into shell and select it. And press the R keyboard shortcut to get the scale tool. And then click in the center to activate both X and Y axes. And once that's turned yellow, then drag to scale up and down. And use the move tool, which is W. Kind of position that. And now we can check that seam. Go back to object mode and select. And then isolate select. Tumble around to the back where we want that seam to be. And it should be somewhere here. And then move our shell around. We might be able to see where that seam is. So there actually is one there. Cool, so we've got that. Go back to object mode. We want to select the opposite of our quick select set now, so we can map the tops and bottoms. Close the UV texture editor for now. And load that quick select set back up again. Right click and go into face component mode. And edit quick select sets, side strip set, and invert the selection. Edit, invert selection. Now the tops and bottoms are selected instead. We can check it in various display modes. Wireframe, which is 4. Looks good. 5 is shaded. And of course 6 is textured. Okay, so back to shaded, which is 5. And we want to just do a planar projection here. And there will be some overlap. If we just project from above, then we'll have some issues as this rounds corners. But we'll resolve those issues later with the UV texture editor. So we're just going to project straight down onto the surface here. So with those faces selected, go to Create UVs and choose Planar Mapping Options. We want to project from the Y-axis, which is the vertical axis. Go ahead and click Project. And let's check it in the UV Texture Editor. Edit UVs, UV Texture Editor. And now those shells are filling the 0 to 1 space. Let's check what we see in the viewport here. We've got a thicker border here, a thicker edge. That indicates a UV seam. We can view this with the texture, which is the 6 key. Okay, so we just want to match these so that they're basically the same scale. Those two shells are currently still selected, and I can move those. When I'm doing this, I may only move one of them. It depends upon how I do the selection. These top and bottom panels here are currently sharing the same coordinates. They're overlaid on top of each other. But if I'm very clever, I can select just a single shell and move it. And you can see now we have separate control over these two. So if I clicked and dragged, I would select them both. But if I just click, I'll select only one. And separate those out. If I want to, it doesn't even really matter in this case. These shells will need to be scaled. Select them, press the R key, and we can scale these. Okay, now if I want to sew across seams, I need to do that now too. So I'll right-click and go into Edge Component Mode. And I want to get to the edges here at these borders and figure out how these need to get sewn together. So this is a little bit more challenging than before. There may be some overlap. We need to address that before we can sew pieces together. And we can actually see this overlap. We can go into Image and enable Shade UVs. And one side of the surface will be drawn red and the other side blue. And where we see this mixture of colors, that's where the overlapping is occurring. I can resolve this by unfolding, but I need to know in advance that when I run the unfold command, it's going to automatically redo my layout. So I'm going to have to sort of redo my work a little bit here. Right-click and go into Shell Component Mode, select, and convert that selection to UVs. Control right-click and choose to UV to UV. With all the UVs on that shell selected, go into the UV Texture Editor menu and choose Polygons, Unfold Options. And you'll see the method is Unfold 3D. Let's increase the iterations here. That's the quality. Turn that up to 5. And click Apply and Close. And it takes just a moment, and it does reorganize our layout, unfortunately. But it stretched these UVs out so that there's no more overlap. Cool, so we can do the other side as well. Right-click and go into Shell, select, Control right-click, and choose to UV to UV. Polygons, Unfold. All right, so we've unfolded the second one. That's the top here. Check our work. Looks like we just need to sort this one out, rotate it around. We need to go back to these seams, figure out which ones we want to sew together. We want these to be scaled the same, and if they're not, we need to fix that. So maybe that whole shell needs to be scaled a bit to correspond to the other side here, so that those wireframe lines more or less coincide. And once again, we do need to sew the pieces together. To get the scaling equal for the texture for the two objects, we can use the existing material, but we probably also want to use the inbuilt checker shader because that's going to give us a much more obvious approximation of the scale of the two UV shells. I want to select both of the objects in object mode. And then go up into the UV texture editor and enable display textured tiles. So the scaling of these checkers here tells me what the actual material didn't, which is that the scale is off for the cushion. I need to adjust that. go over and right click and choose shell, select that cushion shell, and use the scale tool R, and we can scale that. It's a little bit tricky because we can't really scale it while we see the other one. Because if we selected them both, then we would scale them both. So we kind of have to ping pong back and forth here. So that's close enough. I'm in a good place here now because my UV layout is done. Right click, go back to object mode. We can turn off the checkers. Just position this properly in shell component mode. Check our work. Right click, go back to object mode, deselect. And it's fitting in place and the texturing looks exquisite. We just need to give some life to this by sculpting it a bit. But we're in a good place now to increment and save once again.